Welcome back to Holiness to the Lord, and this time I wanted to cover kingly coronations in real life, as well as Hugh Nibley talking about graduation ceremonies and the false robes of the priesthood. So, for those who are unaware, which I was until recently, England got a new king, yay! Which is interesting because of how much it pulls directly from the things that I've been looking at in these studies, temple themes and ordinations and such. So, I wanted to read from this Washington Post article, which is actually just a copy and paste from a Forbes article, but, news is what news is. So it says, the idea of crowning a European monarch began with Charlemagne in the year 1800 and was borrowed from the Bible's second book of Samuel, in which David, ruler of ancient Israel, was given a crown and the bracelet of Saul. Many elements of the UK coronation are unchanged since Edgar, one of the first kings of England, was crowned. What does it mean? In reflection of the UK's constitution, yada yada yada, the ceremony will be performed by Archbishop of Canterbury Justin Welby, the most senior figure in the Church of England. So essentially, this is the high priest, or the highest priest they could get. The event itself takes the form of a liturgy, which is a very formalized ritual, like temple ordinances are, in which a new sovereign receives Holy Communion. So it's interesting that the king is partaking in a covenant with God in the process of being ordained and set apart to be the new king. The central idea of the coronation is to set one human being apart from the rest as the embodiment of both the crown and nation by anointing him with holy oil. The religious link is explicit in the king's title, Charles III, by the grace of God of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and his other realms and territories, king, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith. He is also the supreme governor of the Church of England. Anyway, so really cool things and interesting things. They obviously have very ceremonial clothing that he wears. Crown is a big part, and he's got the things he holds in each hand. Definitely anointed with oil as part of this crowning, and its liturgy, it's very well laid out as to what is going to happen, and all the people come and are witnesses. So witnesses before, God and everyone around, and also, probably angels, God angels, and these witnesses. So yeah, going on to the next section, going into anointing. The tradition goes back to the anointing of Solomon by Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet. The oil, known as chrism, was harvested from the groves on Jerusalem's Mount of Olives and consecrated at the ceremony in the city's Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So, pretty direct ties to, again, the sacrifice of Christ and all that jazz. It's held in a ampulla, a gold vessel in the shape of an eagle with outspread wings. Traditionally it was in a horn, but the oil was blessed by a priest and is poured into a coronation spoon, and the same spoon is used in every one. Again, there's this tradition, there's this wanting to show that you have the same authority, the same things that lent legitimacy to previous kings, because it all goes back to the legitimacy of the coronations in the Bible, which was done under, the hand of a prophet and all that jazz. The king will receive his regalia, including a robe, a scepter, an orb, and a ring. And anyway, it's really interesting and cool that he's specifically clothed in the robes that are meant for him and just him in his place as king over the people. And the golden spurs symbolizing knighthood and chivalry will be placed on an altar. Again, this is all very, very temple themed. There's music playing. German-British composer George Handel's anthem Zadok the Priest will be sung at the coronation. Another symbolic link to the Bible. And it goes back and how this was used throughout all times, and the song itself is derived from the account of the anointing of Solomon by Zadok in the Book of Kings. And then it goes into more detail on how things might have changed and like how it's a homage to the people and over time and different aspects of that. But if you're looking for temple themes, the coronation of a king is pretty spot on, and it very directly says that, hey, we're taking all of this from the Bible. So it's a really interesting way to see very much how all these very liturgical things would have been. Obviously different cultures, different times, different places, but it's got all the same aspects of these temple themes and coronations and such, which is awesome. The other thing I wanted to touch on, which is interesting and cool, is this reminded me of Hugh Nibley's talk he gave at BYU graduation. And I'll roll into that clip, but apparently years before he had mentioned that in a prayer that they were dressed in the false robes of the priesthood. And then he goes on to talk about how the graduation robes and other robes, like robes of judges or like things a king might wear during a coronation, all point back to the same sorts of things, all trying to imitate that great temple and tabernacle experience from the Old Testament. So I'll roll into that clip and I'll leave you off from there. Thanks, and hope you enjoy Hugh Nibley.
23 years ago today, if you will cast your minds back, on this same occasion, I gave the opening prayer in which I said, quote, "We have met here today clothed in the black robes of a false priesthood." Now, many have asked me since then whether I really said such a shocking thing, but nobody has ever asked what I meant by it. Why not? Well, some knew the answer already, and as for the rest, we do not question things at the BYU. But, well, I didn't expect that. But for my own relief, I welcome this opportunity to explain. Now, first, why a priesthood? False priesthood, remember? Because these robes originally denoted those who had taken clerical orders, and a college was a mystery, with all the rites, secrets, oaths, degrees, tests, feasts, and solemnities that go with initiation into higher knowledge. But why false? Because it's borrowed finery, coming down to us through a long line of unauthorized imitators. It wasn't until 1893 that, quote here, an intercollegiate commission was formed to draft a uniform code for caps, gowns, and hoods in the United States. Before that, there were no rules. You could design your own. And that liberty goes as far back as these fixings can be traced. The late Roman emperors, as far as we learn from the infallible Ducange, marked each step in the decline of their power and glory by the addition of some new ornament to the resplendent vestments that proclaimed their sacred office and dominion. Branching off from them, the kings of the tribes, who inherited the lands and claims of the empire, vied with each other in imitating the Roman masters, determined to surpass even them in the theatrical variety and richness of caps and gowns. One of the 4 crowns worn by the emperor was the mortarboard. Oh, I left mine there on the floor. It's the one you're all wearing. The mortarboard. The French kings got it from Charlemagne, the model and founder of their royal lines. And to quote Ducange again, when the French kings quitted the palace at Paris to erect a temple of justice, at the same time they conferred their royal adornments on those who would preside therein, so that the judgment that came from their mouths would have more weight and authority with the people, as if they were coming from the mouth of the prince himself. That's the idea of the robe of the prophet descending on his successor, see? It is to these concessions, continues Ducange, it is to these concessions that the mortarboards and scarlet and ermine robes of the chancellors of France and the presidents of parliament are to be traced. Their gowns are epitogia. The epitogia is this loose robe that's thrown over the rest of your clothing to produce the well-known greenhouse effect, and are still made in the ancient fashion. The name mortarboard, I'm still quoting Ducange, the name mortarboard is given to the diadem because it's shaped like a mortarboard which serves for mixing plaster. It's bigger on top than on the bottom, end of the quote. But where did the Roman emperors get it? Well, for one thing, the mortarboard was called a Justinianeon because of its use by the Emperor Justinian, who introduced it from the east. He got his court trappings and his protocol from the monarchs of Asia, in particular the Grand Shah, from whom it can be traced to the Khans of the steppes and the Mongol emperors, who wore the golden button of all wisdom on top of it. I have a button like that right on the top of mine. A golden button of all wisdom on the top of the cap, even as I do. The shamans of the north also had it among the Laplanders. It's still called the cap of the 4 winds, with its tassel and the rest. The 4-square headpiece, topped by the golden tassel, the emergent flame of full enlightenment, also figures in some Buddhist and Lamist representations, but you get the idea. This Prospero suit is pretty strong medicine, rough magic indeed. There's another type of robe, that's in Shakespeare, incidentally. There's another type of robe and headdress described in Exodus and Leviticus, the third book of Josephus' Antiquities. The white robe and linen cap of the Hebrew priesthood, which have close resemblance to some Egyptian vestments. They were given up entirely, however, with the passing of the temple, were never even imitated after that by the Jews. Both their basic white and their peculiar design, especially as shown in the latest studies from Israel, are much like our own temple garments. Now, this is not the time or place to pursue a subject which Brother Packer has wisely recommends with judicious restraint. I bring it up only to ask myself, what if I appeared for an endowment session in the temple dressed in this outfit? And that's tomorrow, I go to the temple. What if I went up there like this? There would be something incongruous about it, perhaps even comical. But why should that be so? The original idea behind both garments is the same, to provide a clothing more fitting to another ambience, action, and frame of mind than that of the warehouse, office, or farm. The 109th section of the Doctrine and Covenants describes the function and purpose of the temple as much the same as those of a university, a house where all seek learning by study and faith, by discriminating search among the best books. No official list is given. You must search them out, and by constant discussion, quoting again, diligently teaching one another words of wisdom, everybody seeking greater light and knowledge as all things come to be gathered in one. And of course, that's what a university is. All things gathered in one. Well, both the black and white robes proclaim then a primary concern for the things of the mind and the spirit. Sobriety of life and concentration of purpose removed from the largely mindless mechanical routines of your everyday world. Cap and gown announced that the wearer had accepted certain rules of living and been tested in special kinds of knowledge. What's wrong then with the flowing robes? For one thing, they're somewhat theatrical and too easily incline the wearer, beguiled by their splendor, to masquerade and affectation. In the time of Socrates, the sophists were making a big thing of their special manner of dress and delivery. The opening lines of Protagoras on that. It was all for show, of course, but it was dressing for success with a vengeance. For the whole purpose of the rhetorical brand of education which they inaugurated and sold at top prices to the ambitious youth was to make the student successful as a paid advocate in the law courts, a commanding figure in public assemblies, or a successful promoter of daring business enterprises by mastering those irresistible techniques of persuasion and salesmanship which the sophists had to offer. We have some very good writings on that subject. Well, that was the classical education which Christianity embraced at the urging of the great St. Augustine. He had learned by hard experience that you can't trust revelation because you can't control it. The Spirit bloweth where it listeth, and what the church needed was something more available and reliable than that. Something, he says, commodior et multitudini tutior, handier and more reliable for the public, even than revelation or reason. And that's exactly what the rhetorical education had to offer. At the beginning of this century, scholars were strenuously debating the momentous transition from Geist to Amt, from spirit to office, from inspiration to ceremony in the leadership of the early church, when the inspired leader was replaced by a typical city bishop. See, Peter was inspired. Blessed art thou, Peter, for my Father in heaven has revealed this to you. But not the city bishop. He was an appointed, elected official, ambitious, jealous, calculating, power-seeking authoritarian, an able politician and a master of public relations, and we have an immense literature on that, of course, in the Patrologia. This was St. Augustine's trained rhetorician. At the same time, the charismatic gifts, not to be trusted, were replaced as the gifts of the Spirit, were replaced by rites and ceremonies that could be timed and controlled, all following the Roman imperial model, as Alfeldi has shown, including the caps and gowns. Down through the century, the robes have never failed to keep the public at a respectful distance, inspire a decent awe for the professions, and impart an air of solemnity and mystery that has been as good as money in the bank. The four faculties of theology, philosophy, medicine, and law have been the perennial seedbeds not only of professional wisdom, but of quackery and venality so generously exposed to public view by Plato, Rabelais, Molière, Swift, Gibbon, A.E. Haussmann, H.L. Mencken, the rest